Hello everyone, welcome back to our lecture series on the political history of modern Japan. And today I'm going to talk about a topic which I'm very passionate about. It's energy and politics, or the politics of energy, if you will, in Japan. And we're especially going to be looking at the contemporary situation and the history of Japan's energy policy from the 1990s in particular. I wanted to go back a little bit further than that into post-war history. However, as I'll mention more in a minute, I wasn't able to track down all of the sources and materials that I needed in time. So I've kind of focused today's talk instead more on the contemporary period and the last 3 decades. But as I mentioned, I'm very interested in this issue, as I think, or I imagine probably a lot of you guys are as well, particularly because climate change is such an immediate and pressing issue for all of us today. We're routinely feeling the negative effects of climate change in all shapes and forms of enormous hurricanes, torrential rains, landslides, heat waves, you name it, pretty much all kinds of just really bad and undesirable types of weather and extreme weather events that are happening, that they're pretty much just the norm now. And of course, I mean, it's pretty easy in the face of all this to just start to feel helpless and think, well, climate change is just too big. There's nothing I can do. It's going to happen anyway, so, whatever. And it's very easy to become cynical, I think, in this situation. But part of the benefit of investigating and digging into the history of climate change and climate change policy is that it becomes so apparent that this is in no way has climate change been an inevitable happening. It's very much the opposite. It's very much the result of specific and precise political decisions taken by different actors, usually powerful political and business elites. And if we think about it that way, I think what becomes so apparent through investigating that history is that, it's not inevitable. And obviously now at this point in time, we're not going to just magically fix climate change. But of course, we can prevent it from becoming any worse, hopefully. And if we think about it as a political problem rather than just some kind of natural phenomenon, then we start to get a framework for how we can specifically move forward and some actions that we can take to stop things from getting any worse. So that's why I find this issue so fascinating and why I like to delve into the history of it and to look at the politics and the economics of climate change. And as I mentioned, I'd like to look at a deeper history. I think it's important to go back further into the post-war, but in today's talk, I'm just going to basically focus on the time period from the 1990s. So let's begin. And title of my talk today is Energy and Politics, Fukushima, Climate Change, and Beyond. Okay, so as I mentioned already a couple times now, I think it's important to situate Japan's energy policies in um, broader historical context. And this is really what I wanted to do. And I wanted to use a book that I'm very interested in getting a hold of by Laura Hine called Fueling Growth, The Energy Revolution and Economic Policy in Post-War Japan, put out by Harvard University Press in 1992. And I thought this would be a great, fascinating source to kind of illuminate, um, Japan's post-war energy policies. But unfortunately, I was not able to get a hold of this book, at least in time for this lecture. And as probably all of you know, COVID-19 has basically limited our movement. Has greatly limited our movement. And it's just, I was not able to get a hold of this book. So pretty disappointed about that. I look forward to reading it someday. And if you can access this in a library near you, definitely, check it out if you're interested in learning more about this topic. But I'm going to start my talk instead looking at the Fukushima nuclear disaster, the 3/11 Fukushima nuclear disaster in March 2011, right? I'll end up going back further than this in time as well in a minute, but I want to just use this as a starting point for now. And especially here, I'm drawing from two essays by Jeff Kingston. The first, Japan's Nuclear Village, in the Asia Pacific Journal Japan Focus, September 2012. And the second, Power Politics, Japan's Resilient Nuclear Village, also in the Asia Pacific Journal Japan Focus, Volume 10, Issue 12, March 2012. So I'm drawing from these, and these two essays were written, pretty close to the actual time of, just a year after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And this author in particular was writing a lot about this issue, as many of us were. And, especially if we were in Japan at that time, this is something that I think everyone just had on their minds all the time. So these essays now, they're a little bit old. I mean, they're dated in a way because some of the events after this also deserve mention. But this is written very much at the time of that all these things are going on and that major protests are taking place. So that's something just to keep in mind, I think, as I talk about, or as I summarize the contents of these essays. But Jeff Kingston points out the importance of the nuclear village, which is a consortium or a kind of, I don't know what you call it, a combination of utilities, nuclear vendors, bureaucracy, diet, finance, media, academia, etc., etc. He says it's an imagined collective bound by solidarity over promoting nuclear energy. So proponents of nuclear energy, they form this very powerful nuclear village. They exercise power over politics, business, academia, and finance, what have you. And basically they've promoted the agenda that nuclear energy is, quote, safe. And they've done this since the 1950s, since the first nuclear power plants were introduced into Japan. Interestingly, this in the 1950s, this was against the background of very strong anti-nuclear sentiment in response to not only U.S. nuclear testing in the Pacific, but also drawing on Japan's historical experience with nuclear weapons and being the victim of the world's two major nuclear or atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, but the nuclear village, they're totally focused on how, quote, safe nuclear energy is. And at the time of 3/11, Japan had 54 nuclear reactors supplying 1/3 of the country's total power supply. So quite a lot. And Japan was really relying on nuclear power. And this, promoted by the nuclear village, nuclear power was very similar, or this community was very similar to what I've talked about in earlier lectures as the iron triangle of bureaucracy, government, and business as well. And they all kind of promote their like shared interests and focus on kind of ensuring their continued power and making more money, I guess. Kingston points out that this is a clear case of regulatory capture because the two regulatory commissions that were supposed to be like watchdogs for the nuclear industry, most of the posts on those commissions were held with people with ties to the nuclear industry itself. So it's like they're kind of just tasked with regulating themselves. And obviously this didn't work out very well. It led to, in Kingston's words, a culture of complacency with inadequate safeguards. One of these regulatory agencies was NISA. Actually, to be honest, I can't remember what this stands for, but nuclear, some regulatory agency. And this operated under METI, and it worked to downplay the risks of nuclear energy. And they would also try to characterize nuclear energy as critical for Japanese energy policies. And keep in mind, this is the agency that's supposed to be regulating the nuclear industry, ends up just promoting nuclear industry, basically. And these ties were, mutually beneficial for businessmen and politicians because through this system of amakudari, where after a politician would enact favorable legislation to the nuclear industry, deregulation, or some kind of favorable regulation legislation. Then when they retired, they would secure themselves a position, I don't know, on the board of directors or something, or get a lot of stocks in the company, right? In 2012, Madarame Haruki, the chairman of the Nuclear Safety Commission, so this is the other nuclear regulatory agency I mentioned there were two, this is the NSC, he was chairman between 2010 and 2012, and he testified to the Diet that NISA had warned the utilities of the risk of blackouts in 1993, but the utilities refused to listen to this, and eventually NISA backed down. And then he also testified how the safety monitoring technology was out of date and there was insufficient safety regulation. But going back even before this, in 2000, whistleblower already showed that TEPCO, the power company, the utility, which ran Fukushima Daiichi at the time of the nuclear disaster, Tokyo Electric Power Company, had falsified safety reports since the 1980s, so going back, even further. And the media reported on this story in 2000, even though METI was trying to shut it up and trying to put a lid on it. Then in 2007, the government reported that 12 utilities had admitted they had been falsifying safety records for 30 years. But in spite of this, NISA, the regulatory agency, extended Fukushima's operating license, for instance, in 2011, and the reactor itself had been in operation since 1971. So it was already, getting up there in age, and potentially, there were lots of improvements that would need to be made, and perhaps if it didn't meet stringent safety guidelines, would need to be shut down. But, as has already been reported, these utilities, including TEPCO, were falsifying their safety reports. So, and even knowing this, though, they still renewed Fukushima's operating license. The government told utilities to decommission reactors after 40 years of operation in 2012, but there were major loopholes, and they received extensions easily. So this is setting up the stage then for this disaster. Citizens groups also launched lawsuits against power companies prior to the disaster. They would focused on, some of these lawsuits even focused on how they would, be unsafe in the case of earthquakes, but courts always ruled against them. In 2007, a plant in Kashiwazaki had to be shut down due to an earthquake, and it wasn't until after the earthquake then that TEPCO admitted that it knew there were fault lines near the power plant, but they still built it there and were still operating it there. Then, even more damningly, in 2008, a TEPCO study found that the Fukushima nuclear plant was vulnerable to earthquakes and that the seawall was not high enough, but it hid these results, and it ignored, moreover, a very long history of tsunamis occurring in that region. In 2006, the government issued guidelines for utilities to improve tsunami countermeasures, but these were largely ignored. And then, even up until 2011, 1 month before the March disaster, TEPCO lobbied the government to water down reports about the danger of tsunamis at nuclear plants. So there's this long history going back to the 1950s, essentially, throughout their entire history, but here especially covered in this essay from the 1980s of how these utilities were not taking proper safety measures. And when it would be pointed out that they needed to make improvements, they would try to cover that up and do anything they could to avoid making those changes. So after 3/11, utilities were then required to conduct seismic safety tests, but NISA said they could reopen if they were not a significant threat. And of course, they conducted their own tests internally. Moreover, even if the utilities were to cause a major disaster, as in the case of TEPCO in 2011, the government, they could always fall back on the government, which would bail them out with taxpayer money. And thus, in the words of Kingston, they would be externalizing the most catastrophic risks. And this is exactly what happened in mid-2012 when the government bailed out TEPCO. It bought $13 billion of stocks in the company, or stake in the company. And this should have then given it a 75% ownership, 75% ownership of the company. But the government settled for just 50.1% voting shares, which was just enough to give the company money to rebuild while still allowing TEPCO executives managerial control. So Kingston writes, this, quote, subordinated the public interest to private interests. And then as of May 2012, and this is kind of where we see how these essays are dated in a way, but even in the short time of just over a year, TEPCO had already received $45 billion in loans from the government, which were basically coming from taxpayer dollars. The government had also provided subsidies to rural communities to host nuclear reactors in the first place. This was appealing to rural areas which were suffering from depopulation, deindustrialization, and other economic woes. And it's hard to stress this point enough, but the energy from Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant was going to Tokyo. I mean, it was all going to Tokyo. So there are no nuclear power plants built in Tokyo or really anywhere even near Tokyo, because from the beginning, obviously, everyone knew that nuclear power was not safe, and especially if you build it on a shoreline, because they need lots of water to cool the reactors, so you have to build them on shorelines. But in Japan, Japan is a very earthquake-prone country. So, it's a recipe for disaster. And nobody wants to host these things, which is why then they have to put them in poor rural communities, essentially, and then try to give them a bunch of money to essentially bribe them to host these plants. And for instance, in the community of Genkai in Saga Prefecture, 60% of the town budget comes from hosting the nuclear power plant. But there had been opposition to nuclear power plants throughout, but this really crystallized, obviously, after the 3/11 disaster. And throughout 2012, tens of thousands of people marched against nuclear power, some of the largest popular protests and demonstrations in Japanese history. And the public was particularly angered by the government's decision, taken under the leadership at that time of the Democratic Party of Japan, to restart reactors, some of the reactors, which had all been shut down and taken offline immediately after the disaster. Over 100,000 people attended a rally at Yoyogi Park in July 2012, for instance, against nuclear power. But the government and nuclear lobby, the nuclear village, and business community like Keidan Ren basically went into damage control, to major damage control mode, and worked overtime to influence popular opinion back in favor of nuclear power. And so they'd say things like, well, it's necessary, and they had a huge government-sponsored campaign to save energy, Setsuden. And part of what this did was to try to pressure everyone in a way to make them think that there's going to be all these hardships if we don't have nuclear power, basically. And ironically, I mean, even that, and all of these government surveys as well, trying to influence popular opinion, they basically backfired, and they could not shift popular opinion. And even after all of the nuclear reactors went offline, Japan still met all of its energy needs. So just proving that nuclear power wasn't necessary, actually. So it totally backfired. The political right, by the way, has been in support of nuclear power because having especially fast-breeding nuclear power plants and reactors allows Japan to easily and quickly, kind of convert plutonium into nuclear weapons. So Japan obviously doesn't have nuclear weapons at the moment, but the point is that it can easily make them. And I don't have time to really at this time in this talk go into detail on this point, but it's very interesting. If you look at the research of a researcher, Koide Hiroaki, he's written a lot about this issue of one of the other reasons for why Japan is so insistent on keeping nuclear power plants, even in the face of overwhelming popular opposition. And it's so that one of the reasons is so that it can easily manufacture nuclear weapons at any time if needed. In September 2012, this NISA, the previous regulatory agency, was replaced by NRA, the Nuclear Regulatory Authority, but its head, Tanaka Shunichi, had strong ties to the nuclear village, which he admitted and was open about. So people were skeptical of how serious the government was in response, in regards to taking precautionary measures and potentially moving away from nuclear power. And then in October 2012, TEPCO acknowledged that the disaster was due to failure to adopt proper safety measures to save costs and make more money. It admitted lying to the public and the government. And Kingston wrote, TEPCO is probably the least trusted firm in Japan for very good reasons. But opponents of nuclear power were and have been generally unable to overcome the power of the nuclear village. And with the return of the LDP to power in 2012 and 13, there was a solidifying of the nuclear village's political power base. Okay, next I want to shift away from nuclear power, sort of. It'll be in the background. It's part of Japan's energy policy, but I want to look at Japan's policies in regards to climate change, which is, as I mentioned, obviously the biggest existential threat confronting everyone on the planet today. And I want to start with this very interesting chart, which I think really helps helps us to imagine and to envision the attitudes of political parties toward not just nuclear power, not just climate change, but energy policy in general. And this is a chart of Japanese political parties' energy strategies compiled in July 2019. So pretty recent, probably requires some updating, which I don't have the data to do because I didn't compile this by myself in the first place. This chart was compiled, and this data was compiled by Kyoto Network, which is an NGO that monitors Japan's energy policy and promotes renewable energies. But what they did is they took all of they monitored, or they measured all of the different political parties' energy policies in Japan. And it's a pretty simple way that they did it, actually. They just looked at the parties' their websites, essentially, their manifestos, whatever other major public documents they were issuing and making available. And then they measured how closely those things aligned with, for instance, the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement goals, whether or not they supported a coal phase-out, whether or not they supported a shift to, well, my PowerPoint's freaking out, shift to renewables, whether or not they supported a nuclear phase-out, and then they gave an overall score with higher numbers being a, I guess, better score or more environmentally friendly. Or being stronger in tackling climate change, something like that. So low score, not good. High score, better. And they rank them also in with this kind of with these symbols. So a double circle stands for specific. It means the party has specific and ambitious goals and plans. A single circle means that the party has a plan which improves on the current situation, but which lacks strong ambition. A triangle indicates that the party mentions the issue, but they don't elaborate on a plan or goals. An X indicates that the party has a plan, but it would make things worse. And a line, dash line in this case, indicates that the party there's no data available, so the party hasn't issued any kind of policy on it per se. And if you go through them, so the Liberal Democratic Party, the main party in Japan that's been in power basically throughout the post-war, they kind of make nods to the Paris Climate Agreement. They do not support a coal phase-out. They support continued use of coal power. They, again, make a nod to renewables. Think of Prime Minister Abe's, quote, energy mix that he promoted, a little of everything. So probably something like that, but not really getting into any specific details. And the LDP does not support a nuclear phase-out. So Kyoto Network gave them the lowest score. Komeito did slightly better than their longtime allies in the LDP, but not terribly better. The Constitutional Democratic Party received the highest score, along with the JCP, of they have a plan to achieve or to put Japan in alignment with the Paris goals. They have a strong plan to phase out coal. strong plan to shift to renewable, and a strong plan to phase out nuclear. The Japanese Democratic Party also has some plans lacking in a little bit of specificity in regards to coal, so a little bit lower score. The JCP also shares the highest score with the CDP, as I mentioned. They have very strong and ambitious goals. Ishin no Kai basically doesn't have a plan for phasing out coal, shifting to renewables. The Social Democratic Party doesn't have a plan in regards to coal, but does support shift to renewables and phasing out nuclear. And the newest party, Reiwa Shinsengumi, probably, I don't know, I would imagine just because it's still fairly new, and especially at the time that this graph was compiled, the data for this graph was compiled, it didn't have a plan for a lot of things, but it did not actually support phasing out coal either, and it was fairly ambiguous about a shift to renewables, so it also got a pretty low score. So I think this kind of, I mean, I don't know, this graph makes things very clear for me, this table. I like to kind of go back to this every once in a while just to, help separate the rhetoric of what politicians say a lot of times from the actual policies that they enact and what they're really doing, I guess. Oops. Okay. So this next graph, this is from the Union of Concerned Scientists. So this previous graph, I made the graph. I compiled the data from Kiko Network. The rest of these graphs I did not make, so I'm just borrowing these, and I'll try to cite them as best as I can, so that I don't get into any copyright issues. But Union of Concerned Scientists titled Each Country's Share of CO2 Emissions. And this data is from 2020, so it's up to date. China has the most amount of CO2 emissions at 28%. The rest of the world doesn't even equal China at 21%. The United States comes in a third at 15% of global CO2 emissions. Then India, Russia, and Japan here. So in this extrapolation, Japan is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you count all of the countries of the rest of the world, they're not on this graph. But generally, this is not counted as a country per se. So Japan is typically ranked, I think, 5th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5th worst CO2 emitter, 5th largest CO2 emitter in the world. Japan is the 3rd largest economy, by the way. Here's another chart that extrapolates the data, the same data, in a slightly different, or visualizes it in a slightly different way. This is from Our World in Data. Great website, by the way. Lots of really easy to understand charts and graphs about climate change. And this ranks kind of by region, kind of by country, who has contributed most to global CO2 emissions. And actually, this is nice because this takes into account historical emissions, which is very important to consider when we think about responsibility for climate change. And here the United States is by far the leader at 399 billion tons, 25% of global cumulative emissions from 1751 to 2017. Then following that would be the EU, so 353 billion tons. I'm fairly positive that the UK, the Great Britain, is included in here, as it should be, because it also historically has emitted the a lot of CO2 emissions in its role as one of the first countries, or the first country to industrialize and to lead the Industrial Revolution, which was, of course, based all on fossil fuel consumption. And then following this up, we have China at 200 billion tons. So its historical roles are still much lower. Its historical emissions are still much lower at 12.7%. And Japan at 16 billion tons, 4%. Okay, and then this graph, compiled by the EIA and obtained from Wikicommons under a Creative Commons license, shows where Japan gets its power from what sources it gets its power from what kinds of fuel, from the years 2000 to 2017, and listed in terawatt hours. And as you can see, Japan gets most of its energy, especially after the March 2011 Fukushima disaster. Here, prior to that point, nuclear power was higher than fossil fuels, then kind of right around the same capacity, and then completely drops off, and fossil fuels take over. So leading us to the point where we are today, where Japan gets by far the majority of its energy from natural gas and coal. This other here, this indicates renewables, essentially, listed as other in this chart, which remains quite low, but as you can see, is rising. Hydroelectric power, which is not typically regarded as a kind of renewable energy because it has, for various reasons, but it has quite large ecological footprint, would be right here. Petroleum, so oil especially, would be this line, and then nuclear power, which, following some restarts of reactors and reactors coming back online, has been going up, but still remains quite low from the time of the 3/11 disaster. This is the same data, basically, just, again, visualized in a slightly different way. This graph is from nippon.com. And it shows electricity generation in Japan by source. And here we can see that coal consumption has been rising, and it remains steady. So Japan has not done a good job at all of phasing out coal. We can also see up at the top where it says new sustainable energy. This is the green up at the very top. This has been growing a little bit, but it's essentially, it seems, kind of been filling some of the gaps left from nuclear power, but not coal, importantly. Okay, so to shed more light on this topic of climate change in Japan, Japan's how it has responded to climate change. I'm going to highlight some information from a great essay by Koichi Hasegawa called Climate Change Governments in Japan, Critical Review on Japan's INDC and its Energy Policy, which was published just this year, so very recently. I couldn't even get a hold of a physical copy of the book, so just got this on Kindle so far. But it's published in a volume titled Climate Change Governance in Asia, put out by Routledge this year. And in the essay, Hasegawa starts out by just laying down some of the basic background and facts to the issue. Japan is the 5th largest emitter, as I mentioned, as we saw in the graphs, emitting about 3.5 to 4% of the global share of CO2. Per capita, Japan is the 4th largest emitter. And as I mentioned, Japan is the 3rd largest GDP. But the government, as we already saw from the previous graphs, has been reluctant to support renewables, and it's been heavily reliant on coal and nuclear. Climate change policies are not high priority for the government of Japan, and most environmental ministers hold their post for only about a year and remain unfamiliar with the issues in general. Hasegawa then looks at 2 of the most important, global kind of conventions on climate change. And the first is the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And only 38 countries set targets under the Kyoto Protocol to reduce greenhouse gases by 2012, but it was legally binding. On the other hand, at the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, all parties, and although the U.S. later withdrew under the Trump administration, but all parties initially signed the Paris Climate Agreement, which agreed to limit global warming below 2 degrees Celsius and to strive to make efforts for limiting global warming to 1.5 Celsius by the end of the century, by 2100. However, the document was not legally binding. But Prime Minister Abe at the time and Minister of Environment Marukawa Tamayo didn't mention the Kyoto Protocol at Paris, even though the Kyoto Protocol had a pretty good reputation in the international community. It was legally binding, and it was perceived as taking, I guess, fairly strong steps. Some would argue, of course, certainly not strong enough, but internationally, it had an all right reputation. But Abe and Environment Minister Marukawa did not mention this at all at Paris. And Hasegawa asks, why? Why didn't they mention this? And then he shows how this is because they didn't highly evaluate the Kyoto Protocol. And indeed, the government, the Japanese government, under the DPJ even, didn't commit to the Kyoto Protocol's second target at COP17 because the government, Japan, claimed that it was unfair to advanced countries. And at that time, China, Russia, and the U.S. didn't adopt this second target either. Neither did Korea or the BRICS countries. So the Kyoto Protocol eventually only covered 22.6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And under this, Japan was supposed to have, its final goals were it was supposed to have a 6% decrease in emissions, but the government and the business community, Keidanren, criticized even this as being too tough. So they didn't evaluate the Kyoto Protocol highly at all. Okay, and that expired then in 2012. And then in 2013, Japan set a small target of a 3.8% decrease from fiscal year 2005, from the fiscal year 2005 level by 2020. But, we have to be careful we have to look carefully at the years here. I mean, 2005 CO2 levels, greenhouse gas emissions were already quite high, so it's a decrease from an already high point. And as Hasegawa notes, this was actually a 3.1 increase from the levels in 1990. So depending on where you compared it, it might look like a decrease, but it was actually still an increase. So it's not really a target at all. And this was 30% lower target than the EU Commission recommended. In 2015, Japan announced that it would meet the 6% greenhouse gas decrease, the target that it agreed to under the Kyoto Protocol. But in fact, Japan's emissions rose throughout this time, as they did basically everywhere, as I'll show in a later slide. In 2007, for example, there was an 8.6 rise compared to the 1990 level. And between 2008 and 2012, average annual emissions rose 1.4% over the 1990 level. So why was there this gap? Why did Japan claim, despite its CO2 emissions and GHG emissions rising, why did Japan claim that it met the 6% reduction that it agreed to? Well, Japan was able to subtract its greenhouse gas emissions through forest sinks, which subtracted 3.9%. But, I mean, this is the idea of forest planting trees, especially, to mitigate to offset countries and companies' climate emissions, um, it it hasn't really been. There's not a lot of scientific data that definitively proves, how much you can offset through planting trees, and it's been criticized by environmental groups as what's called greenwashing, because it allows companies to basically continue or to even increase their CO2 emissions and just kind of write it off and say, well, I'm planting a bunch of trees. The other way that countries and companies can offset their carbon emissions, which Japan did to meet the 6% decrease goal, was by buying foreign carbon credits. So countries that meet their goals, that don't emit a lot of CO2, get carbon credits, and then Japan buys those. And other countries, wealthy countries, buy those to quote, offset their emissions. So 1.4 minus 9.8, 1.4 actual increase minus 9.8, offset decrease equals minus 8.4, which exceeds the 6% decrease goal that Japan had set. So in fact, the only time that greenhouse gas emissions actually went down was after the 2008 financial crisis. And this was really a crisis of production, a slowdown of production, which is what caused that, which is where the problem for climate change actually lies. And this was true globally as well. Okay, then Hasegawa. I'm still continuing on the Hasegawa article here, although I occasionally add some of my own commentary, but he goes on to look at the effects of the 3/11 nuclear disaster, but importantly in relation to Japan's broader energy policy and its climate change policies. In the nuclear disaster, by the way, after the nuclear disaster, it's important to remember there were 160,000 people that had to evacuate the area after Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant basically exploded and shot radiation and radioactive waste everywhere. They shut off this, they blocked out a 20-kilometer radius around the plant. Some people and research shows that such guidelines, that first of all, 20 kilometers was either not enough, or that these guidelines in general are rather arbitrary because it's very difficult to track flows of radiation. But nevertheless, just in this 20-kilometer radius, 160,000 people had to evacuate. In March 2017, some people were allowed re-entry, but as of September 2019, there are still 42,000 evacuees who cannot return and probably may never be able to return to their home communities. The LDP bears most of the blame for the disaster, as I've shown, through its close connections to the nuclear village and its adoption of very lax standards and other forms of corruption. But the JDP actually took the fall for the disaster since it was in power at the time, Prime Minister Khan, for instance. And 3/11, globally, though, it brought about denuclearization efforts. I mean, even in Japan, if popular opposition has not yet been enough to defeat the nuclear village, I think just by watching the video footage of the power plant exploding would be enough to convince most people that nuclear power is not safe. And in Germany, for instance, which took one of which followed which took some of the most stringent actions against nuclear power, decided to abandon all of its 19 reactors by 2022. Taiwan also abandoned all of its promised to abandon all of its 6 reactors by 2034, and Korea announced that it would denuclearize over the next 40 years. Previously, Korea was in a fairly similar position to Japan in that it got 30% of its power from nuclear power plants. But in contrast to this, in Japan, it's basically gone. Things have gone the other way. These reactors, which were put offline immediately after the disaster, many of them have restarted. And the LDP and METI in general have hardly changed their energy policy. And Hasegawa writes that they don't appear to have learned any lesson from the Fukushima accident. After Fukushima, there were a feed-in tariff system, a FIT, abbreviated as FIT, tariff system was enacted in 2012, which allowed people to feed in power to the grid that they would take in from solar panels on people's homes, for instance, and receive cheaper energy bills or some compensation for that, tax breaks, whatever. And as I mentioned, there was this new independent regulatory agency established in 2012, but as I pointed out, it was under the influence of the nuclear village. The LDP then revised its strategic energy plan in 2018, which showed that it was continuing to rely on nuclear power. And as of December 2019, there were 9 nuclear power plants or reactors operating almost exclusively in Western Japan. In December 2016, Japan did abandon the Monji fast breeder reactor, and as Hiroaki, sorry, now I forgot his name, but as other research has pointed out, that this fast breeder reactor was never successful in really recycling nuclear waste for reuse. And as I mentioned, its purpose rather has been speculated by experts to be for producing nuclear weapons. And then, anyway, Hasegawa asks at the end of the essay, why can't utilities, why can't Japan abandon nuclear power, fossil fuels, and shift to renewables? And he says one reason is that all of these actors have just invested too much of their assets in nuclear power plants, and they need to keep them operating to extract a profit. And also, the invested loss asset value could be a huge, would be a huge financial blow for people who have, for all of these people who have invested in it, since companies' stock values, etc., are predicated partly on this. And Hasegawa writes, the electric power companies are against denuclearization because of the fear of corporate failure. Oh, sorry, that wasn't the end of the Hasegawa essay. It keeps going on. Good essay, by the way. So, as you can see, I'm spending quite a lot of time on it. Okay, so then what are Japan's climate plans moving forward? Well, or is Japan moving forward? That is a legitimate question to ask. In July 2015, Japan submitted its intended nationally determined contributions, INDCs, to the United Nations Climate Change Convention. And these proposed a 26% decrease of CO2 emissions from fiscal year 2013. This was a 17.4% decrease from the 1990 level, but this was criticized for being too small of a target. Also, the year, why make it a decrease over 2013 levels? That was criticized as well. And if you break it down actually by industry, how these decreases are being made, for the industry sector, this only amounted to a 7% decrease. Their role in this was a 7% decrease, while commercial and other sectors bore 40% of having to make up for this decrease. So it was too lax. Basically, the goals were too lax, or they were too lax on one on the industrial sector and too harsh on the other. So there are numerous criticisms posed of this goal. And METI also proposed an energy plan in 2000, or also proposed its own energy plan in 2015, in which it proposed 22 to 24% of its energy would come from renewables by 2030, 20 to 22% from nuclear, 27% from liquid natural gas, 26% from coal, and 3% from oil. So as you can see, this is very much illustrating Abe's idea of what he called an energy mix, a little bit of everything, but keeping nuclear power basically at the same level at renewable and not increasing renewables, totally dramatically. hanging on to nuclear, hanging on to coal. Coal, even by 2030, under these guidelines, would still be higher than renewables. And more interestingly and importantly, as Hasegawa points out, METI predicated this on the assumption of 1.7 annual growth. But this is quite unrealistic for various reasons. First, because it's predicated on increased energy consumption, which has not been happening in Japan. Due to declining population, energy consumption in Japan has been going down over the years. So first of all, it doesn't reflect reality. And then actual economic growth in Japan has been very low. It's been about 0.7%, 0.7% between 2010 and 2015. So 1.7% is quite a big increase in growth, and it's not realistic, and it's probably not going to happen. So why did METI then, envision such a high growth rate and energy consumption going up? Well, it's because they wanted purposely to inflate the numbers of where their energy would come from in their energy mix, and particularly they wanted to hang on to nuclear energy so that they could argue that it's still necessary to meet energy demands, even though these energy demands that they predicated did not reflect reality in any way. And then just in another broader sense of how this plan is just completely out of step with the way that things are going, growth has been successfully decoupled from nuclear and greenhouse gases around the world, and more companies are dropping coal and dropping nuclear and still predicating and still growing their economies. There's a popular mainstream idea even of green growth, which I personally don't think is possible or agree with. But I mean, even this is mainstream discourse, essentially. The consensus is already formed that green growth is possible. But nevertheless, Japan is reluctant to adopt this idea and to introduce bold climate plans. It relies only on voluntary efforts from the industry at decarbonization. There's no carbon pricing system nor a nationwide cap and trade program. And Hasegawa writes, there's weak political leadership on climate issues for both the ruling parties and the opposition parties. Mitigation policies for climate change does not bring popularity, votes, or money for any politician. Few Diet members who back climate issues receive any benefits for their efforts. And I think this is really it, basically. I mean, this is the reason, because it doesn't pay, unfortunately, to support climate change or rigorous climate change policies to decarbonize society in Japan at the moment. I think it could, and there's a lot of essays that have been coming out, in the news over the past, quite a few years, talking about how coal is essentially a stranded asset, how even, changing energy prices, how, renewables are going to be cheaper than coal, and are already cheaper than coal in many cases, how these big companies and governments and banks investing in coal plants, they're going to be stranded assets very soon. So, I mean, it's not, even from a financial perspective, a good investment. Even if people are only focused on making money and not saving the environment, it's not a good investment. But nevertheless, this just is not reflected in Japan's climate policy at the moment. And in 2012, to make matters worse, and I'm going to get into this in more detail, but really, I think the most surprising thing, and it demonstrates Japan's lack of commitment to tackling climate change, is that in 2012, the government drew up plans to build 50 new coal power plants. This would double the electric output from coal in Japan, and it would put Japan out of reach of achieving its Paris Agreement targets. And this is in spite of the fact that coal plants are being retired around the world, even in major polluters such as the US and China and India. But METI continues to support the construction of new coal plants because at the moment still, but rapidly changing, coal prices are cheaper than natural gas as well in Japan. So this is one thing it's concerned about. And also METI wants to force the public to choose between nuclear and coal. So here again, we we can't escape the nuclear issue in Japanese energy policy, and the nuclear village, even to this day, in that METI is basically forcing the public to choose. Like, hey, if you want to tackle climate change, you're going to have to accept nuclear, because otherwise we're going to go ahead with a bunch of these new coal power plants. Is essentially what it's saying. And also, METI and Japanese companies want to export nuclear and coal to developing countries like Indonesia and India. Coal plants constructed in Sendai, there have been coal plants constructed in Sendai, where the tsunami devastated the region during the 2011 earthquake. And ironically and sadly, the same situation we observe in the case of nuclear power is being reproduced in the case of coal power, because the electricity produced from this coal plant in Sendai is being sent to Tokyo, while Sendai residents are left to face the negative consequences of burning dirty coal in their backyard. And these have faced 3 coal power plants in Sendai, Kobe, and Yokosuka, have faced strong opposition, local opposition, and been sued by local residents. Meanwhile, other civic groups have fought against coal and have pushed for divestment, but it has been difficult for them to fight against vested interests. Okay, and that brings me to the end of Hasegawa's great essay. And it's a good essay. It did a lot, kind of really laying out the issues and summarizing the issues very concisely. It was a little bit focused too much, I thought, on these international frameworks and agreements such as the Kyoto Protocol and the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, because, actually, to be honest, more critical scholarship has criticized those agreements themselves as not going far enough. So Hasegawa is saying, Japan doesn't meet it's might not reach its Paris agreements, but other more critical scholars would say that, well, the Paris agreements themselves don't go far enough to tackling climate change. And I think this becomes very apparent when we look at climate change and the issue of global CO2 emissions, not just as an issue of national politics per se, or looking at it just in the framework of nation states. And I think this is where we need to look more at, yes, there is climate politics, but also this is very much involved in the global economy as well. And climate change is a result of our global economic model, essentially. And this is why I think we also need to look at those economic aspects and different forms of climate finance and how people profit off of climate change. So this is what I'll do in the following slides, which is mainly just a bunch of data and charts and graphs and news articles that I've pulled together from all over the place, because some of these are so new, just from last year, from this year. So it's still kind of a little bit difficult to put them in historical perspective right away. But I want to talk more about this issue of how climate change is connected to our current economic model. And Naomi Klein has written a lot about this. And in this slide, especially, I'm drawing from her book, This Changes Everything. But she talks about how trade, especially, how different trade agreements, which have been adopted at the same time as these international climate agreements, are basically working at opposite ends, in opposition to each other. And this really illustrates also the problem of setting these nationally determined goals, which mainstream scholars like Hasegawa focus so much on, and why they're just not enough, actually, to solve climate change. So CO2 emissions have increased with post-Cold War free trade agreements, or they've increased in tandem, or perhaps because of even such agreements. So is in 1992, the first United Nations Climate Convention on Climate Change was held, the United Nations Earth Summit. But that same year, the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was signed by the Clinton administration. And in 1994, the World Trade Organization was formed. So there were these promises being made to tackle climate change, but at the same time, there was moves toward unfettered trade, and deregulation of trade, and toward a greater flows of capital around the world. And importantly, shipping and transport are not included in any of these frameworks for tackling climate change, and they're not included in national climate emissions either. So this is a major problem that these trade agreements are directly contributing to, essentially. And then labor and production at the same time have just moved to the developing world and to China, even though products that they make are consumed by rich countries, so that rich countries' CO2 emissions are basically exported to the country which then is forced to produce their goods so that they can purchase them. And to make matters worse, companies can sue governments for impinging on their profits under trade agreements like NAFTA. So for instance, US companies sued the Canadian government in 1988 when it tried to block the incorporation of harmful fuel additives into imported fuel. And just to show how these frameworks on climate change are fundamentally, basically, they're predicated on an economic model of continual growth. And they also are totally held hostage to this ideology of unfettered growth and unbridled capitalism, and how deregulated trade is somehow a good thing or is important for the economy. So the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change includes the line, "Measures taken to combat climate change should not constitute a disguised restriction on international trade." So take measures on climate change. Yeah, sure, go ahead, do it, but only within national boundaries, and as long as it doesn't impede on making money. In 1997, Kyoto Protocol included a similar line, "The parties shall strive to implement policies and measures under this article in such a way as to minimize adverse effects on international trade." And Naomi Klein, she has a great passage from This Changes Everything, which just demonstrates the problem with national goals, with trying to tackle climate change or even envision it at a national level. And she says, "Countries are responsible only for the pollution they create inside their own borders, not for the pollution produced in the manufacturing of goods that are shipped to their shores. Those are attributed to the countries where the goods were produced. This means that the emissions that went into producing, say, the television in my living room, appear nowhere on Canada's emissions ledger, but rather are attributed entirely to China's ledger, because that is where the set was made. And the international emissions from the container ship that carried my TV across the ocean and then sailed back again aren't entered into anyone's account book." So there's all these CO2 emissions that are just completely unaccounted for, and this is where a great majority of them are produced. And this is the problem with these international frameworks and how they're completely subservient to our current economic ideology. And just to illustrate the problems of this in data, for instance, to make it easy to visualize, this is a graph on annual CO2 emissions, global emissions, taken from Our World in Data, again, great site. We can see that all of this is essentially from the Industrial Revolution, completely shooting up here in our reliance on fossil fuels, and as well as our adoption of our current economic model. But interestingly, and what I want to point out in connection to the last slide, is the incorporation of these global frameworks trying to limit climate change. And just to demonstrate how little of an impact they've actually had. So the first 1992 UN Convention on Climate Change would come right about here at this point, where we can see that global CO2 emissions just completely shoot up and rise from this time. There's no dip. There's no dip after this. There's a little dip here, but the climate conference was at the end of that dip. So, I mean, it's having essentially no effect. The 1997 Kyoto Protocol would come right about here. Again, no significant, no visible decline of any kind after this. And the 2015 Paris Agreement would come right about here, and emissions continue to rise. So, unfortunately, they're not successful, and it's not enough just to rely on these frameworks or to look at them as this kind of magical solution to things, which mainstream scholars, including Hasegawa, whose essay I really liked, tend to do, basically. And it is important to hold, actors accountable to these international agreements, but at the same time, I think we have to realize that the real problems for climate change lay elsewhere. I also want to look at, talk about Japan's climate finance. Since 2015 Paris, Japan approved the construction of 8 overseas coal plants, including Van Phong 1 project in Vietnam. The plant violates OECD standards on coal plants, and it would emit 5 times more particulate matter than plants in Japan. In fact, 80% of the 8 overseas coal plants constructed by Japanese public finance don't have proper particulate matter filters. Likewise, the Indramayu coal plant in Indonesia, JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, has given $1.8 million of public finance to build or loaned to build this plant, but it lacks the best available technology to filter particulate matter, and because of this and other reasons, it faces strong local opposition. A 2018 report by the National Resources Defense Council found Japan to be the second worst performer for fossil fuel in regards to providing fossil fuel subsidies, and that it provided the most public finance of any of the G7 nations to fossil fuels. Japan public finance was provided through institutions such as the Development Bank of Japan, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, and all of these financed fossil fuel extraction and construction at home and abroad to the tune of $12 billion taxpayer money per year. In 2018, 350, the organization 350.org, reported that Japanese megabanks were the biggest investors in coal around the world. Mizuho was the biggest investor in coal in the world. Mitsubishi was second, and Mitsui was fourth. In 2019, 350.org also reported that Japanese megabanks had invested $186 billion into the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Agreement. In December 2019, Japan received the second Fossil of the Day award at a UN conference for failing to commit to phasing out coal plants, to the great annoyance of Environment Minister Koizumi Shinjiro. Koizumi Shinjiro is Koizumi Junichido, former Prime Minister Koizumi Junichido's son. And whither Japan? Where might Japan go from here, or what? I'm just kind of touching on then some of the most recent news. Prime Minister Abe resigned, and Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide took his place. And he said in October 2020, shortly after taking office, that Japan will aim to cut its CO2 emissions to net zero by 2050. And this was received quite positively in the domestic and international press, but there are a couple important things to look out here, rhetorical things to kind of be careful about here. First of all, his intent is clearly to show that Japan will aim for this, so just setting a target, will try, basically, to cut its CO2 emissions, and then to net zero. This is a term that's thrown around a lot, but what this means is that This accounts for offsetting carbon, as I've already showed in an earlier slide, offsetting carbon emissions through actions like planting trees and buying carbon credits from less polluting countries by 2050. So again, it's not clear whether this means an actual reduction in CO2 emissions, but this is kind of the global fad right now of governments to set this kind of 2050 net zero goal. But it's important to keep in mind what the term net zero actually means. And then the other kind of important popular fad at the moment is to pass climate emergency declarations, which Japan did. Just this month, the Japanese Diet passed a non-binding climate emergency declaration. But again, climate emergency declarations are just an acknowledgement of climate change without laying out any real specific policy. And I think this is probably part of the reason why so many governments are adopting them, because they find it kind of a convenient rhetorical tool that they can make themselves look good, basically. It's a kind of PR. While in effect, perhaps not really adopting any serious strategies. So will this rhetoric be matched with action? And I leave that as a question mark. And then just to sum up, then basically what I've talked about here and through these essays, the summaries of essays, and lots of other data and news articles and all kinds of things that continue to be published on this topic. One of the things that came up then was the 3/11 Fukushima nuclear disaster. And as I showed through the reading of Kingston's essays, this resulted from profound negligence and corruption at the highest levels of the Japanese business and political establishment. It prompted massive popular resentment and opposition to nuclear power. Yet far from bearing the full burden of responsibility, the nuclear village has retained its grip on power. And then in regards to climate change and fossil fuels, Japan is one of the OECD countries worst affected by climate change in the form of floods, torrential rains, powerful hurricanes, etc. Rising sea levels threaten Japanese coastal cities, and floods and rising temperatures are already wreaking havoc on Japanese agriculture. And if we spend any time in Japan, but basically anywhere where we are in the world, doesn't matter, we're all experiencing the effects of this, of climate change, which are wreaking havoc on our society and how we go about our lives. But despite this, the government of Japan has taken an extremely passive stance vis-a-vis climate legislation. The government has failed to make strong commitments to phase out coal, although this may be changing. It's hard to say. This is something to keep our eye on. And it continues to fund coal power plants at home and abroad. And this brings me to the end of my talk. As you can tell, I'm quite passionate about this. There's a lot of other data and interesting slides and articles that I wanted to share today, but it's just not possible. I had to limit myself to a short amount of time. And again, as I mentioned, I think it's important to review Japan's energy policies in historical context, which I wasn't able to do totally for the entire post-war here. I just focused on the time period basically from 1990. But nevertheless, it's an important few decades, and I hope that just having an understanding of these few decades will maybe help us to see, to understand how Japan got here and where it might be going, to speculate about where it might be going or where we hope it might go in the future. So thank you very much for listening.